Float drags? They're how you smooth your infield after a game or after nail dragging. Whether pulled behind a tractor or pulled manually by hand, float drags will level your infield to a uniform depth for more consistent bounces and better playability. Steel mat drags work well on all types of infields, and for that reason, they are the most commonly used float drag. The steel mat will break up soil chunks and accumulate some material as it goes, redistributing material in the process. Using a leveling bar with a steel mat will really knock down the soil, leveling and filling low spots. For that reason, you'll want to stop dragging where you began, so any material collected is put back where you started. A steel mat drag works well as a hand-pulled drag. They're not as long and won't collect as much material, making them easier to pull by hand.
One of the most commonly used finish drags is a steel mat drag like you see here. Now the steel mat drag can do quite a few things. First of all, in soils where you get a lot of chunking, this steel mat drag, because of the action and the friction that occurs as the soil moves through this drag, helps to break up those chunks real easily. Now on the downside of this drag is that because it can take up this soil and pulverize it and move it around, it tends to load up on soil. So this kind of drag mat typically transports a lot of material. When you start out dragging, it loads up and it pulls material away. So as an operator, you have to be conscientious that wherever you start a drag on the infield with a steel mat drag, you have to finish it. Because you've taken material away, you've got to put it back at the end. These drags are great for any type of infield soil, whether it's a top-dressed infield or not, but especially crucial for an infield that does not have a top dressing, because you need this type of a drag to break up soil chunks. Ahead of the steel mat here is what's called a leveling bar. Now, the leveling bar does exactly what it says it does. It levels material out ahead of it. What it actually does is do the brunt of the work ahead of the drag. So if you hit an area out ahead of this, where you have a lot of loose material, say right around second base where sliding has caused a pileup of material on the other side of the bag, the leveling bar grabs the majority of that material and spreads it out along the width of this drag bar before the drag comes to it. So the drag doesn't have to do so much of the dirty work. The drag basically is just going out and finish smoothing it off. It's the drag bar that takes the bulk of that loose material and spreads it out for it. This is really a crucial piece of equipment, especially when you're using a Coco-Mat drag.
Another float drag option is the Coco-Mat. It will literally just float over the surface with minimum displacement of material, which means you can stop and start whenever you want on the infield. Their dense fiber will smooth over top dressing, and they're great after a rain. But they will not break up soil, so that means it's better to use them on fields with top dressing. Coco-Mat drags will not work as well on soil-only fields. The best strategy is a Coco-Mat used in combination with a leveling bar pulled by a tractor. Then you can come back along the base paths and home plate with a Coco-Mat hand drag.
Now, the Coco-Mat drag is another great option for infields, but there's a big difference between how the Coco-Mat operates versus a steel mat or a drag broom. The Coco-Mat has a very thick, dense fiber on the underside of it. This is the side that's going to be turned down onto the soil and dragged across the infield. Because of this dense fiber, this particular drag mat will not pick up or transport a lot of material. It literally just hovers over the surface and smooths out all the imperfections on the surface. Consequently, because of that, this drag mat cannot break up soil chunks because of the lack of friction and intense activity like you see inside a steel mat drag. So this type of a drag is really meant more for top-dressed infields only. I really would never recommend this for a straight soil infield. This has to be used with a top-dressed infield so that it can just smooth the top dressing over. The other benefit to a Coco-Mat drag is that in situations where the infield soil might be a little damp, maybe you've had a little bit of light rain, or it's just a little too damp to the point where you can't use a steel mat drag because it'll end up building up on the steel mat drag. A lot of times the Coco Mat drag can go right over that and still smooth off that surface. You might get a little bit of a collection of the material on this mat on the underside, but it'll easily shake off once it dries, but you aren't going to get a buildup. And the best thing, again, when you pick that drag mat up when you're all done, there's not a big pile of material to distribute. You can start and stop this drag wherever you like because you're not going to transport that material.
We've made mention of starting and stopping points briefly thus far, but it's actually very important. Whenever you are transporting material while dragging, you need to be aware of where you are starting and stopping. At your starting point, the drag will load up with top dressing or soil. Where you stop is where the collected material will be deposited. For that reason, where you start is also where you need to stop.
All right, so now we're getting ready to start to drag. And you can see on the back here, we have the steel mat drag. Now, wherever I start, I'm going to pull material away because naturally that drag is first going to want to load up before it's going to drop material off. Okay, so if I'm just going to come out here, drag and pull off, wherever I start the drag, I've got to finish the drag because where I've pulled material away, I've got to put it back.
Your field will develop high spots and low spots as players play, field maintenance crews do their job, and Mother Nature takes her toll. With fields sloped towards the outer edges for better drainage, that also means rains will transport material following the slope of your infield. The areas shown in these illustrations show you the common high or low spots on your infield. The challenge is to stay ahead of Mother Nature. A steel mat drag is the best way to pull top dressing or soil back to the highest elevations of your sloped infield to maintain proper drainage. Remember the clock method? This alternating drag method works for float dragging too. With the face of a clock as your guide, determine your starting and stopping points, just as we described in the previous section. Rotation of your starting and stopping points won't completely stop degradation, but it will slow it down drastically.
Now, what happens over the course of time is material tends to move down this infield. Remember, most infield soils, infield skins are sloped so that water drains off them on the surface. Well, what happens is as you get some heavy rains, that soil or top dressing will tend to move along with it too and pile up towards the back. The way to fix that is to periodically take your drag and start somewhere along the back edge and start your drag there. You pull material away, and when you end the drag, you're going to end it towards the front of the infield. And if you do this on a rotational basis, where maybe every other day you're starting at a different start position along the back edge of that infield, you're starting back there and you're leaving it up in the front part of the infield, then you'll keep the supply of material coming back up to the top so it can move back down. So it's kind of like a cycle where it starts on the front of the edge of the infield, works its way back from wind and rain, and you pull it right back up again. That's the best way to keep your infield so that you don't get too bad of a degradation of that infield slope.
We've covered a lot with regards to dragging, but there's still more to come with dragging patterns. Try this pop quiz to make sure you're keeping everything straight with nail dragging and float dragging.